Hello and welcome to ILTV's Israel Daily. I'm Aaron Porras, and coming up in today's newscast, crossfire over the northern Israeli border with Lebanon. Israeli Air Force fighter jets retaliating against rocket fire earlier on Wednesday. Meanwhile, a senior Israeli official announcing that Israel maintains talks with nearly all Arab states, even those who are enemies. Stay tuned for what that means to international diplomacy. And finally, evidence of a massive earthquake so famous that it was mentioned in the Bible, and it's now been discovered in Jerusalem for the first time. To begin, a grave escalation along Israel's border with Lebanon. Israeli air forces retaliating against launch sites in southern Lebanon just hours after militants in Lebanon launched a pair of rockets towards northern Israeli communities.
ושמענו איזה פיצוץ אחד או שניים עמומים, לא הבנו בדיוק מה קורה, ואז התחילו להגיע מלא שמועות שהיו נפילות באזור של קריית שמונה. ולצערנו הרב, תמיד שיש נפילות, אז מתחילות השריפות. עם השריפות בדרך כלל מסכן את כל האזור פה, הורס את הטבע.
Thankfully, however, no injuries or damages have been reported, with one rocket landing in an open area and the Iron Dome defense system intercepting the other. Then Israel following up with at least 2 air raids overnight Thursday, Syrian media and the IDF both reporting the destruction of several launch sites and, quote, infrastructure used for terror in Lebanon, end quote. Meanwhile, Lebanese President Aoun, for his part, calling Israel strikes an escalation that shows aggressive intent. Defense Minister Gantz and other officials, however, are alleging that the culprits come from one of the several Palestinian militant groups dotting Lebanese territory, and that Israel will not hesitate to respond where necessary.
النظر عن هوية مطلقي القذائف الصاروخية، فالعنوان واضح: تتحمل حكومة لبنان المسؤولية الكاملة عن أي عملية إطلاق نار من داخل أراضيها نحو إسرائيل. الحديث عن عدم سيطرة الدولة اللبنانية على نشاطات الجهات الإرهابية الفاعلة بها. إسرائيل من جانبها لن تسمح بإطلاق النار من لبنان تجاه سيادتها مهما كان ولكل سبب من الأسباب.
Meanwhile, in other Middle East news, a somewhat surprising report. Senior Foreign Ministry official, outgoing director of the ministry's Middle East division, Chaim Regev, alleging that Israel maintains at least some form of contact with practically every Arab country on earth, even those officially deemed as enemies, like Iraq. And joining me now to discuss is Executive Director of J Street Israel and former Israeli diplomat Nadav Tamir. Nadav, thank you so much for being with us. Now, what do you make of this report? You know, is it surprising to you at all?
Not at all. This is a well-known fact for those in the know. But what happened in recent years is that if in the past the foreign ministry was always in the news announcing everything they do, and the Mossad were behind the screens, now it's the reverse, and you hear all kind of things that the Mossad are doing for PR purposes, but the foreign ministry learned how to work in a very effective way, including with countries that we don't have diplomatic relations. And some of those activities actually led to the Abrahamic Accords. So Chaim Regev was completely right, and I'm happy that he's letting the foreign ministry get some credit before he leaves his position and goes to be our ambassador to the EU in Brussels.
All right, so going back to some of Regev's comments, when Regev says some form of contact, what exactly does he mean? You know, are we talking phone calls or letters, tin can on a string?
Well, of course, it's not full diplomatic relations, so there's no embassies, but there are connections, and there are ways to interact, physically and not physically, also by all kind of media. So the nature of those relations is that they're effective as long as they're not, are open up. So I don't think it will be wise to get into details, but the fact is true. And it's very wise. And also the fact that you need to have some kind of relations also with countries that are not your friends is critical to promote your interest. It's a much more sophisticated way to conduct diplomacy.
All right, now another interesting point is that Regev, in his comments, he clarified the covert contacts do extend to Iraq, but not to Lebanon, Syria, and Yemen. He did not mention Iran. Is it possible that Israel is holding some of these secret talks even with Iran? Is that a silly question?
I don't know. I believe that this question, those who know don't speak, and those who speak don't know. But it's hard for me to believe that's the case, because Israel is making a lot of efforts to press other countries not to deal with Iran. So I don't think it makes sense that Israel is having those relations on their own.
All right, now one of my final questions is, you mentioned the Abraham Accords and how that's just one example of a success story of some of these secret communiques that have been ongoing for years. But with respect to some of these other countries as well, is this evidence of warming ties, or is it purely business, or is it really just from country to country?
Yeah, it depends. Every case is different. In some places, you want the Israeli economy to benefit from connections, even if the diplomatic relations are not that great. We see, for example, with Turkey, that while the diplomatic relations were going down, the trade and economic relations was going up. But sometimes it's preparing for opening up of diplomatic relations. This is what happened with some of those countries of the last wave of normalization. It needs a lot of preparation before things actually are realized as diplomatic relations.
All right, Nadav, Tamir, thank you so much for your insights.
You're welcome.
Moving on, as you probably well know, coronavirus cases in Israel are increasing dramatically, and the Health Ministry Director General, Professor Nachman Ash, is responding with dire warnings. Ash telling the nation's major hospitals to, quote, prepare for a complex situation. That said, not everyone is seemingly too worried. A new critical report in Hebrew media revealing that alternate Prime Minister and Foreign Minister Yair Lapid has been skipping every single COVID cabinet meeting. The infection rate in Israel today holding around 3.3%. That's around 3,400 more sick people overnight, at least 241 of whom are in serious condition, and the death toll breaking past 6,500. Hospitals across the country, meanwhile, instructed to keep emergency rooms and dedicated COVID wards open, and Israelis are again encouraged to vaccinate, particularly if older than 60 and therefore eligible for a booster shot, at least 262,000 having already received their third doses as of Thursday morning. Not everyone is as involved as you might hope, though. The Khan public broadcaster reporting that Yair Lapid, Israel's alternate prime minister, foreign minister, and alternate COVID cabinet chair, has skipped all 4 of the COVID cabinet meetings that have been held since it was reestablished in June this year. Lapid responding to heavy criticisms, though, that he's not necessary at the meetings and that his representatives attend and keep him in the loop. In any case, with Lapid's input or not, under threats of possible new lockdowns, the COVID cabinet approving a slew of new restrictions, effective Sunday, August 8. Among them, an advisory to stop hugging, kissing, shaking hands, or unnecessarily gathering in closed spaces. Also, the Green Pass system will be extended to gatherings of fewer than 100 people and for all ages as of Friday, August 20. Masks must be worn in all gatherings. The public sector will shift to a 50% work-from-home model, while the private sector is encouraged to go as remote as possible. And finally, sweeping travel restrictions, dividing the planet into red, orange, and green, will be passed. Red requiring a 2-week quarantine and special permissions to both leave and return. Orange meaning quarantine upon return, but no permissions needed. And green meaning quarantine on return as well, but only until a negative COVID test is produced. And now for the latest in an ongoing saga that is sadly not as sweet as its subject matter. Dozens of American Ben & Jerry's franchise owners, who together generate over $23 million in annual revenue, coming together against the corporate office. An open letter signed by these franchisees calling on Ben & Jerry's and their parent company Unilever to rescind their July decision to stop business in the, quote, occupied Palestinian territories. With me to analyze their complaints, CEO of the International Legal Forum and attorney Arsen Ostrovsky. Arsen, it's great to have you back with us. Could you maybe just sum up some of the main points of the letter? Why are these franchisees rebelling? Is it ideological? Is it money?
Look, I have to say, my heart goes out to them. It's really heartbreaking. They write, first of all, how they've been, how that personally their lives have been affected by this. How many of them have been shamed by customers, by those people they know, as if they're part of this decision that's been brought down upon them from the Ben & Jerry's head office. At the end of the day, they are there to sell ice cream, not engage in politics. So what's essentially happened is that they've been thrown under the bus by Ben & Jerry's global office. But what's truly important here, and I think that also goes to a large extent to explain why they felt the need to write such a letter, and they make it very explicit that they have suffered, I quote, substantial financial loss. People are not purchasing ice cream to their stores. They're not visiting their stores. They are losing money out of this decision by Ben & Jerry's. So what they said essentially in the letter is that, the conflict itself is a complicated one, and that they do not want to be drawn into that. People are free to choose as they wish, but not when it adversely affects their business and their interests, including under the franchisee agreement with the Ben & Jerry's global company. So they've asked for, in the end, is for Ben & Jerry's to withdraw and rescind this decision, because it is having not only a personal effect, but also having a substantial financial effect on their business and their livelihood.
Yeah, I mean, I know we had it just on the screen a minute ago, but I feel like the ending of their letter really sums it up quite nicely. Those who feel strongly about Israel and they want to boycott it or some part of it, of the territory it administers, are free to do so. They cannot, however, do that at our expense. Do you suspect that Ben & Jerry's will ever reverse course on their decision, or will they just double down and hold firm?
Look, I don't know. I don't think anyone has a crystal ball where they can look into that. But I do believe, and as we're seeing now, there is immense fight back against Ben & Jerry's. It's not only the franchisees that are speaking up. There are various organizations, NGOs, pro-Israel groups, including within Israel and outside in America, that are speaking up, and that they see this not only as something that is discriminatory and illegal, but that really essentially acquiesces unequivocally to the BDS movement. I think as the chairperson of Ben & Jerry's has said, that her intention was essentially to boycott all of Israel. She wasn't talking about which side of the green line. She was talking about all of Israel. And that, whichever way you look at it, is not only illegal and discriminatory, but also inextricably anti-Semitic.
All right, so speaking of the legality issue, what other pressures have been mounting? I've heard of several states joining in on the threat to use anti-BDS laws against Ben & Jerry's and Unilever. Florida, for one, I think being the most recent, to give Unilever 90 days to reverse course. How do you see this progressing?
Well, I think this could have a potentially major significance. We've had, in addition to Florida, as you said, gave 90 days for Unilever to overturn this decision, or otherwise face a threat of Florida withdrawing all of their investments in Unilever. But it's not just Florida. There's, I think, half a dozen states now, including Texas, New Jersey, New York, Illinois, Maryland, I think Rhode Island as well. So Unilever stands also as a parent company to lose a substantial amount of money through loss of contracts, but also potentially under these state anti-boycott laws, which would require the states also to withdraw or to divest from pension funds, for example, in Unilever. It could prevent Ben & Jerry's seeking contracts in a number of states. And there's also the possibility of legal action here in Israel under the Israeli law. So there's certainly a lot of angles with which are being looked at the moment. But one thing is certain is that both Ben & Jerry's here in Israel and those who stand with them and stand opposed to the boycott campaign will not stand idly by.
All right, Arsen Ostrovsky, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Changing topics now, the Bank of Israel's efforts to protect and strengthen the shekel apparently paying off. Israel's currency now at the strongest rate that it's been since the bank announced its foreign currency purchasing program around 7 months ago. But is this strength deserved, or will we see a rebound in the near future? Joining me to discuss is former member of the Economic Advisory Board with the Israeli Ministry of Finance and head of the Foreign Equity Research at XNES, Gilad Alper. Gilad, thank you so much for being with us. Now, how does the foreign currency purchasing program work exactly?
So what happens, the Bank of Israel basically decides to help exporters, right? Because as the shekel gets stronger, the competitiveness of Israeli exporters abroad is being damaged. So what the Bank of Israel does, they basically print shekels. With those shekels, they buy US dollars, thereby supporting the US dollar exchange rate versus the Israeli shekel, thereby helping Israeli exporters. That's the plan, at least.
Okay, so what are the limits of such a program, and are we nearing those limits now? We've seen reports that in the first 6 months of 2021, we've actually gotten quite close.
So the limits are that basically whenever the Bank of Israel prints shekels and buy dollars, it's being done at the expense of the Israeli citizenry, right? Because for us, for people that live in Israel, a strong shekel is good because it increases our purchasing power, it lowers the cost of living, and this is basically the fruits of the strong exports of the State of Israel that we should enjoy. And with the Bank of Israel prints shekels, they don't let us, the citizens, enjoy the full benefits of the strong shekel, of the strong exports. And there's some other costs associated with printing too many shekels. Basically, the Bank of Israel can actually lose money by paying interest on those shekels, and that loss eventually gets to us. So there are some other costs. But the big point is that the Bank of Israel is basically fighting the forces of the free market. The reason that the shekel is so strong is because exports are very strong, right? Israel makes a lot of high-tech products. We have successful entrepreneurs that set up small companies, startups, and will sell them, and that creates a strong inflow of foreign exchange into Israel, which is what is basically the main reason behind the strong shekel. So when the Bank of Israel fights that, it basically fights the free market. It fights the strength of the Israeli economy. And that's something that usually ends up with the victory of the free market and the loss of the Bank of Israel, which is why we also have a lot of speculators in Israel, just assuming that the Bank of Israel will eventually break and won't be able to continue and print shekels. And that's another cost, by the way, that we have to incur.
So, is that what Energy Finance CEO Yossi Frank, when he was speaking to Globes, means when he says that this could backfire, that the Bank of Israel is asleep at the wheel?
Yes, so I think he's got it backwards. I mean, the reason we have that speculative power or pressure is because the Bank of Israel is involved in the market. If the Bank of Israel wasn't involved at all, and the only thing that actually was determining the exchange rate was the free market, and let's say we would be now at, 3 shekels per dollar, then there was nothing for speculators to do because this is the free market. This is the exchange rate as it should be. The reason you have speculative pressure is because the Bank of Israel is involved and is fighting the forces of the free market. The speculators are there only because they think the Bank of Israel won't be able to continue and contend with the forces of the free market. This is completely the fault of the Bank of Israel for intervening to begin with in this market. And if the Bank of Israel wants to truly get rid of the pressure from speculators, assuming it's a bad thing, it's not even clear it's a bad thing, but assuming the Bank of Israel wants to solve the problem, they can simply announce formally and emphatically that they no longer try to intervene in the foreign exchange market, and they're going to let the free market do what it does best, which is finding the equilibrium prices, or at least push to a process whereby the exchange rate is being determined by the actual market, not by the decisions of some executives at the Bank of Israel.
All right, you've given us a lot to think about, a lot to worry about, I guess. Gilad Alper, thank you so much.
My pleasure.
All right, now it's time for our daily recap on the 2020-2021 Summer Olympic Games, where we give you the latest on Israel's Olympic team in Tokyo, Japan. And back with all the updates is ILTV's Chana Rifkin.
Israel's historically large Olympic delegation pushing now into day 13 at the 2020-2021 Summer Games in Tokyo, Japan. And the morning already starting with a pleasant surprise. Israeli swimmer Matan Roditi exceeding his team's and even his own expectations, coming in 4th place in the 10K marathon swim. The team hoped he'd finish in the top half of the 26 swimmers competing, and Roditi says he hoped to break the top 8. But in an incredible accomplishment that Roditi himself said is hard to digest, the 22-year-old crossed the finish line in just 1 hour, 49 minutes, and 24 seconds, 23.8 seconds behind Italy's Gregorio Paltrinieri, who took home bronze. As for gold and silver, the honors going to Florian Wellbrock of Germany and Christoph Razovsky, respectively. Then finally, moving to tomorrow, Israeli rhythmic gymnastics stars Linoy Ashram and Nicole Zelikman set to compete in the individual all-around qualifications round, followed by Ashley Bond, Danielle Goldstein-Waldman, Alberto Michan, and Teddy Vlock in the women's and men's equestrian team jumping qualifications.
In other news, an incredible tale of ancient life and its destruction, whispered to Israeli archaeologists in Jerusalem through a newly published discovery. Ongoing archaeological excavations at the City of David National Park in Jerusalem now releasing new evidence of a massive earthquake that rocked the Kingdom of Judah roughly 2,800 years ago, and the awesome event so indelible that it appears to have been mentioned in the First Testament or the Torah. Of course, evidence of an earthquake isn't exactly simple to identify, so how is it done? Well, researchers explained that there were neither signs of fire nor of any deliberate event that would have caused the buildings to collapse. And that's not all.
We began to try and think of what could be behind this destruction, and we found ourselves looking at the first verse in the book of Amos, which mentions an earthquake. Remains of destructions from this earthquake were exposed in various sites in Israel, but this is the first time where we find remains in Jerusalem.
Meanwhile, artifacts at the site, including bowls, lamps, and cooking utensils, providing a snapshot of what Jerusalem was like just moments before what's thought to be one of the most devastating earthquakes of ancient times.
האדמה הייתה כל כך חזקה שהתושבים שהגיעו לכאן בנו בעצם מעל ההריסות, וזה אפשר לנו לבוא ולגלות את כל הכלים היפים שמצאנו פה. כלי שולחן מאוד קטנים, פקים, שיכולו נוזלים, וכלי הגירה מאוד גדולים שהמיוחד בהם היה פיתס, שעל הידית שלו עיצור מיוחד בצורה של פרצוף. רעידת האדמה הזאת השתמרה כל כך בתודעה של אנשי יהודה, 200 שנה אחר כך הנביא זכריה מדבר על הרעש הגדול שהיה פה.
Finally, before we go, it's time to learn some Hebrew with the latest of our limited weekly lessons from our friends at Ulpan O.
מה את רוצה לאכול?
אני לא יודעת. הכל טעים פה. אולי אני רוצה פיצה. או אולי סלט. אתה יודע מה אתה רוצה לאכול?
כן, אני רוצה לאכול פסטה.
אתה יודע מה? גם אני רוצה לאכול פסטה.
מעולה. ומה את רוצה לשתות?
קולה. אני תמיד רוצה לשתות רק קולה. ואתה?
אני רוצה לשתות מים.
סבבה. סליחה?
All right, that is it for today's news. Today's exchange rate is 3.21 shekels to the American dollar and 2.56 shekels to the Canadian dollar. And finally, for the latest updates and news from ILTV, please like ILTV on Facebook, follow us on Instagram, and subscribe to our YouTube channel, as well as to our newsletter at iltv.tv. I'm Aaron Porras. Be well, and thank you so much for watching.